Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time you're viewing this podcast. This podcast series we call Race, Culture, and the Church. Race, Culture, and the Church. I invite you to go back as far as we go back, 30 plus episodes, started 1 week after the murder of George Floyd. And we've entered into space and had different guests, luminaries, to speak on those issues of race, culture, and the church. If we can hit all three areas in any 30-minute podcast length, we're doing great. We definitely hit 2 out of 3, and I am convinced we're going to hit all 3 today, as I think we have hit a new high in terms of guests in our space today. I am so pleased. I am honored to have present here, literally and figuratively, in this 1931 sanctuary, city church, Dr. Marilyn Nelson. Thank you, Doctor, for being here this morning with us. It is such an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Let me just introduce you to our audience. I've shared with City Church. I said there's only one Dr. Maya Angelou. There's only one. But there's also only one Dr. Marilyn Nelson. And as I shared with City Church, I said, as we were introducing you to City Church, and we'll get into the whole history of the beautiful nexus that was the building that we're in, that was the home to First English Lutheran, now is the home to City Church. You were a former member of First English. I guess I'll just go down that path now. Military, not say brat, but military child. Your father did a couple of tours of Air Force duty, took you here to Sacramento, Mather, McClellan, graduated from Hiram Johnson High School.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess Hiram Johnson, it still looks like Hiram Johnson. Have you had a chance to go by and take a peek at it?
We drove by yesterday afternoon. There's a new football field.
Okay.
So I didn't recognize the place until we came around the corner to the front of the school, and there was Hiram Johnson.
As an aside, I tutored there trying to make my way through college. I did math tutoring there. That would be between 1976 and 1980, sometime in between there. I did tutoring there. Had a good remembrance of Hiram Johnson.
Good.
Graduated from UC Davis University, University of Davis, and you went to the University of Minnesota to get your master's or doctorate?
No, from Davis, I went to the University of Pennsylvania and got a dropping out master's degree, and then worked for, I became a professional Lutheran, and then went back to school. I was teaching at St. Olaf College and went back to grad school at the University of Minnesota. So.
And at some point, University of Connecticut came calling and said, "We'd like you to be a professor here." It's just that easy, huh? I mean, the path, it's how life can turn on a dime, if you will. As you said, you were a professional Lutheran, and you had shared at a previous meeting, a gathering, how you worked as a dorm mom or something of that, but basically a shepherd of Lutherans that were matriculating. But then you went to Minnesota. Then you ended up in Connecticut.
Yes. Let's see. At Cornell, I was a lay associate in Lutheran campus ministry. So I was the assistant of a wonderful pastor, Lee Snook, who became a theologian and taught at Luther Seminary. And then I decided to marry a guy I had met in graduate school at Penn. And, we moved to Oregon. I'm skipping some steps. I was thinking I could fill you in, and now I can't remember we lived in Oregon, and then we lived in Denmark, and then I was invited to St. Olaf, so we moved back to the States, and that's where the University of Minnesota comes in. So there were some steps leading back to Minnesota.
So I'm thinking of a child's coloring book. I just gave an outline. You filled it all in.
Right, yeah.
just brightly and wonderfully. As a professor, and again, I'm going to circle back here in a minute, but as a professor, teaching, was it literature or poetry specifically? Was it everything you thought it would be? Or did you even have any expectation?
I didn't really have any expectations. I wanted to live in an academic community because it was the closest. Davis was pretty much the closest thing I had experienced to the military life of living on base. And I didn't really think too much farther than that the academic community would be a community I would want to live in. And teaching turned out to be the icing on the cake that turns out to be the cake itself, because teaching was so wonderful to see light come into students' eyes when I said something, and I could see them learning it and appreciating it, or seeing their essays grow in depth. And, it was very rewarding. Teaching is a very rewarding career, I think.
I could only imagine, as a pastor, I'll say bootleg teacher, but a pastor, that teaching, when the light goes on and you feel like, I could step back now. You get it. You understand. I do. I can appreciate that, not as robustly as you, undoubtedly. You've probably
more. Don't you think more robustly?
We'll arm wrestle over that, Doctor.
Okay.
But I appreciate your kindness. I can only imagine there were hundreds, if not thousands, of lives that you were able to touch and influence.
I hope so. Kids who went through my classes. I don't know.
Some were weak,
you get to the
some
end,
were not.
Well, if you go to the mall at the end of the semester, 2 weeks after you've handed in your grades, and you go to the mall and you see one of your students walking down the hallway and they walk right past you.
Wow.
They don't even recognize you.
Or if they did, I didn't appreciate that C you gave me. So
Yeah.
Well, the reason I bring all of that up is that I was blessed to, again, this incredible research team of me that we have. I read something. It was a portal, internet portal. I'm sure authorized by you, with a heading, "How I Discovered Poetry." And I'll just read this. And we spoke a bit before we started recording. But I would like you to reflect, because I received what I'm about to read accurately. But obviously I wasn't there. How I Discovered Poetry reads, "It was like soul kissing, the way the words filled my mouth as Mrs. Purdy read from her desk. All the other kids zoned an hour ahead to 3:15. But Miss Purdy and I wandered lonely as clouds borne by a breeze off Mount Parnassus. She must have seen the darkest eyes in the room brim. The next day, she gave me a poem she had chosen, especially for me, to the all, except for me, white class. She smiled when she told me to read it, smiled harder, said, oh, yes, I could. She smiled harder and harder until I stood and opened my mouth to banjo-playing darkies, pickaninnies, disses, and dats. When I finished, my classmates stared at the floor. We walked silently to the buses, awed by the power of words. I shared before and I share now, this is very, it's tough for me to read, tough for me to take in. So you talk about the power of words, the power of the tongue. Um, what grade were you in at that time? Miss Purdy's class?
I was in 7th grade, I think.
7th grade.
Mm.
Middle schooler, very impressionable. It can go hard one way or the other.
Mm.
God be praised, it went the way it went. Unpack that for me, Dr. Nelson, that whole 7th grade experience.
The scene of the, okay, this was, because we were in a military family, it has a lot to do with where we were. My dad was stationed at an Air Force base, which I think doesn't exist any longer, but it's in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. And we lived on base and were sent to school in town, a small Oklahoma town. I'm sure it was not easy for this school, for the teachers, because they were used to teaching farm kids in Oklahoma. And we came in, my sister and children of another African-American family. We were the only Black kids in the school system. And so I was the only one in middle school. And the teacher, Mrs. Purdy, she was, what we say when we want to feel unkind. She was an Okie. My mother was an Okie too, so she was also literally from Oklahoma. The teacher didn't know how to deal with us, and I was used to being the star of the class and teacher's pet everywhere. And then we came to this school, and Mrs. Purdy and she taught English, and her husband taught math. And these cocky young Air Force kids came in, and we gave them a hard time. I know we gave Mr. Purdy a hard time because we were always correcting his math on the blackboard. And so I'm trying to give her side of it. It was a new experience for her. And when the poem tries to describe the fact that she was the one who introduced me to poetry, reading these classic poems. There's a reference in the poem to a poem by Wordsworth. I think there are 2 references to classic English poems. And she could see that I was moved. And her way of responding to that was to think that I think she must have thought I'm not quite sure. I think she must have thought that I would more properly read poems written in dialect. Before the Black Arts movement, there was a literary movement of white Southern writers writing in Black dialect. I know the name of the movement, but I can't think of it right now. In any case, that's what she was having me read. It wasn't, some people reading this poem think she was offering me something by some famous African-American poet, but she wasn't. This was from this earlier racist movement, literary movement.
Minstrel work.
Yes. So that's the situation. She brought in this poem because she wanted me to read in dialect. And I looked at it and said, but I don't know this. I don't speak this language. She said, you can read it. nobody else in the class can read it because, it's your language. And she, in a cruel way, forced me by smiling, forced me to read this poem because she had selected it to humiliate me in front of my all-white classmates. And what I remember of the response of my classmates, they were my friends. They were white and I was black, but we were friends. And they were so embarrassed for me. I will never forget how it seemed to affect them as much as it was affecting me. I don't know if you want me to talk more about it, but that's situation.
You've spoken an encyclopedia. What was the follow-on, the days, weeks, months after in Mrs. Purdy's class?
I don't remember anything. I remember that scene. I remember that we all walked out of the classroom
in silence.
And I don't remember anybody ever mentioning it again.
I think that's divine amnesia that God gives us from time to time. Again, you could have gone either way. I am steering clear of poetry, public speaking. You are an incredibly humble woman, and you have such an extensive resume. And I invite the audience to Drew Escobar. He will put that lower third bar on our podcast and direct people to your website so they can see more, learn more about you. The resume is too long to even go over. The number of books, the number of awards, poet laureate for 5 years for the state of Connecticut. I wasn't a poet in my English class in 9th grade, Mrs. Fong. It's a poet laureate. The oracle, I look at that. I don't know what the official description is, but I consider a poet laureate the oracle for the community, for the state of Connecticut, for the entire state of Connecticut.
Wow.
I need to introduce.
Laureate.
I need to introduce Dr. Marilyn Nelson to Dr. Marilyn Nelson, but to have that platform, that privilege, that the roots, the roots were started in a 7th grade class of a bigoted English teacher.
Yes, I guess that is I've not seen it that way before, but it was the beginning of something. Mrs. Purdy. Oh, do I have to tip my hat to her?
It's funny you say that. I was thinking, I'm not Dr. Marilyn Nelson. I'm not. But if she were alive, I'd send her a card along the lines of what Joseph shared with his brothers. I forgive you. I love you. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. Look at what has happened from your misdeed. And if she's a confessing believer, who knows? You just never know. But that aside, from that point to poet laureate to being here, you've got a couple of books there. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to read one or two pieces that really speak. That if I were in an elevator with Dr. Nelson, and I said, boy, give me the essence of Dr. Nelson, which poem would that be?
First of all, may I ask you to call me Marilyn?
I'll do my best, but there's no promises.
I write, for the most part, about history. Let's see if I have something that
Oh, yeah, I know you have something
short
wonderful.
and worth reading. Here's one. This is from a book called Carver, A Life in Poems. It's a biography of George Washington Carver. Everyone knows George Washington Carver as the Peanut Man, but he was a very deeply committed, spiritual, religious man. I believe he was a saint. I believe that if he had been raised in a different church, he would be canonized. Yeah. Well, this is just a portrait of him. Here he is in 1918. I'm imagining, since he was a scientist, I'm imagining that he read of new developments in science with interest. In this poem, I'm imagining he's reading some kind of an article about the discovery of the dimensions of the Milky Way. This was discovered by, I guess it would call an astrologer named Harlow Shapley in 1918. So the title of the poem is The Dimensions of the Milky Way. And one other note, Carver spent most of his adult life teaching at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and he never married. He lived in the men's dormitory. He had 2 rooms in the men's dormitory. That was his life. Behind the men's dorm at dusk on a late May evening, Carver lowers the paper and watches the light change. He tries to see Earth across a distance of 25,000 light years from the center of the Milky Way. A grain of pollen, a spore of galactic dust. He looks around. That shagbark, those swallows, the fireflies, that blasted mosquito, this beautiful world. 100 billion stars in a roughly spherical flattened disk with a radius of 100 light years. Imagine that. He catches a falling star. Well, Lord, this infinitesimal speck could fill the universe with praise.
That is incredible. I am reminded of the psalmist where he asks rhetorically, "What is man?" It's just when you give the dimension. I was in my engineering mind, 100 light years deep, 25,000 light years or whatever you had shared wide. That's a disk, and we're still known. And known intimately. I've shared with regularity, God gives us gifts. He gives us what he gives us. And we have, much like the parable that Christ shared with the talents. So what are you going to do with the gifts? And you have had 7 decades of opportunity to do incredible work, including penning something like that, that gives folks a window into their soul and the bigness of God, the universe. Words have such incredible power to put us in place. We don't have to physically be, but we're almost more there than if we were there, if you will, painting that picture. I don't give too much credit to a 7th grade teacher who's a bigot, but that ability to put to word spiritual, soulful depth. Your mom, your dad, Marilyn? Where's that wellspring draw from? Grandmother, grandfather?
All of those places, they're like rivulets flowing into a larger stream, or not even maybe a larger stream, but a stream that grows from them. I come from a family with generations of people who had ambitions to write. My grandmother was a teacher and was known to be an orator. Somebody told me my grandmother came from a small town in Kentucky, but left as an adult. And I was there doing family research. I was told that this woman I was talking to there remembered that my grandmother came back to town in June of the year this woman graduated from high school. There was Mrs. Mitchell. Nobody had seen her in years. She was an old woman with a walker, and she came in the back of the gymnasium at high school graduation, and the principal was speaking and said, "There's Mrs. Mitchell. Mrs. Mitchell, would you like to say something to the graduates?" And my grandmother walked up to the front of the room and turned around and said Hamlet's soliloquy, "To be or not to be," just presented it. And that's what the family was like. There were people who valued literature and valued the word. My father wrote poetry and plays. My mother wrote a version of what's a Dr. Seuss Christmas? Is
Horton Hears a Who?
No, the Christmas one.
Oh, How the Grinch Stole Christmas?
Yes, for her class, she set that to music so the kids could act it out and sing it long before it was done by whoever did it and made it famous. It was the sort of thing she did for an elementary school class. Let's do it. I'll set it to music, and she played the piano, and the kids performed it, and that's what I grew up with. And I was very much encouraged by my family to read and write, and then I had a lot of teachers who were wonderfully encouraged. Set Mrs. Purdy aside. My 6th grade teacher in Kittery Point, Maine, on the Maine coast, where we lived for 1 year. At the end of the year, Mrs. Gray went up and down the rows of kids in the class and told us what she thought we would be when we grew up. And she said, "Marilyn, I think you will be a well-known writer, especially of poetry for young people." That was a white teacher in Maine. It was the first Black family ever to live in this town. And we were, I don't know, it was home. The next year, we were in Fort Worth, Texas, going to segregated schools in Fort Worth. And my English teacher there, Miss Jackson, brought in regularly her copies of poetry books by Black poets to loan to me. She gave me a sort of side course on poetry because she knew I was the one who would appreciate this. It was a tremendous gift, like a private course in African American poetry. Of course, it was in Paul Laurence Dunbar High School, so it was even better because she began every day by reading a poem by Dunbar. He's a brilliant poet, brilliant. So I except for Mrs. Purdy, I was encouraged and I would say even pushed by teachers as well as by family.
Your father was one of the last Tuskegee Airmen?
He was a member of the last class to graduate from Tuskegee. So, I mean, there are still a few of them still around.
Surviving,
but,
yes,
yeah.
the last class.
Yeah.
I can only imagine that either said or not said, expectations had to be high because expectations were high for him. Could not be as good as, you had to be better than. But it doesn't sound like you felt, I mean, the opportunity was always there and you were encouraged, but did you feel nudged, pushed? You can get an A B's not acceptable, that kind of?
I did, yes. Yeah, I except with the Purdy's. And my father, when I would go home saying, you know, I did really well on this math test. It's math test, and Mr. Purdy gave me a C. And look at it, how many things are correct. And there's a big red C on it. My father said, we could fight this. I can go in and raise hell in the school. But you know that you are only going to be here for this short time. And if you can bear it, then you'll be free of this teacher who has made it his responsibility to punish you for being Black. You know you won't be here. He's just a blip on your road, or not a blip, but what do you call these?
Speed bump.
Speed bump, yeah. He's just a minor speed bump. You know, I believe in you. You know that we believe in you. And you'll be able to look back and say, yeah, at some point. So I think his decision was probably right. Some people might think we were running away from it, or he was running away from a confrontation, but
there were battles that you pick and choose, and I can growing up in the mean streets, not growing up, but being born and living for a decade on the mean streets of Bakersfield, California, I can appreciate some of the situations that you had to confront as I entered into, went from public school to private school. And I was very much the minority in that situation. And you navigate those areas and you pick and choose which battles you're really going to fight hard on, and others that it's like, okay, I'll just chalk that up. I know I'm running out of time. Drew Escobar he's given me the high sign. I can be here all day. This is one of those conversations that I would love to extend and continue to speak about. I know when was the last time prior to this week that you were in Sacramento? Has it been a while?
It's been a long while, yes.
Okay, so we need to shorten up the time between visits, if not even make your return a more permanent thing. And we will, as I shared, joking but not joking, I'll have to arm wrestle Pastor Frank Espergren for your allegiance. He'll try and pull you to St. John's. Don't believe him. Don't believe him. You just come on over to City Church. You are an incredible poet, incredible person, incredible woman, incredible, dare I say, saint of God. Do you have another poem you can share with us as we draw our time together that you could read for us?
I do, yes. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Pastor Meeks. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, this is my home church. This is where
that's
I
all the
was
more reason to be.
confirmed.
Well, that's case closed. We have no more discussion. I will share that information with Pastor Frank.
This one of the things I feel is my responsibility as a poet is to celebrate people who are brave and wise, and also to celebrate people who are allies. I don't think they get enough credit. My grandfather was raised by a white family that just found him when he was a lost child,
Wow.
and they raised him. And I've had so many experiences of, and I say this because in the air right now is a sense of mistrust and
Inward gazing, to say the least. We are. I don't know if it was Augustine who had said it. We are curved in on ourselves. We really are, and so there is a huge level of distrust and intentional isolation. But even in that isolation,
yeah.
we find how lonely and sad we are. So we're fearful of the other, and we're fearful of the being lonely too. So it's a conundrum that I really see us being in societally writ large. It's just, I don't trust you, but I'm sad to be by myself.
But that's okay. That's what one of the things that fuels my writing is that sense of wanting to point at self-isolation and to suggest that, it was the sermon on Sunday, reaching beyond boundaries, reaching with hope beyond boundaries. And I read this poem on Sunday. So I'm kind of thinking that I shouldn't read it now, but it says what I intend to say. It says something
Please.
that's a part of what I'm trying to do is to, let me just read the poem. It's called Nelson's, and it's a description of something that happened when my family was driving across country in the 50s, the 1950s, in the middle of all of the turmoil of sit-ins and fire hoses washing people, police dogs and white citizens councils. And in the middle of all of this happened. My father reaching beyond boundaries and the response. So again, it's called Nelson's. When military personnel traveled in those days, they wore their uniforms. They do now in airports or something. They wear their uniforms so they can be recognized and receive special treatment.
Move to the front of the queue.
Yes. Okay. Daddy's handsome, uniform, new haircut. But the travel baby bed in our seat crowds me and Jennifer. We kept asking, are we there yet? Every few endless miles until Daddy shouted, hey, and braked. We braced ourselves. We skidded, turned, and spit gravel up a long driveway ending at a barn. Barking dogs. Mama whispered Daddy's name. A light-haired man came out. He calmed the dogs and looked at Daddy with inquiring eyes. Daddy called, hello, we saw your mailbox. We're Nelson's too. I fly B-52s. Would you mind letting my girls see your farm? That's why I'm here petting this stupid cow.
That
Yeah.
that is beautiful. That is so beautiful.
And it happens, it can. One of my sister was in theater for many years, and one of the phrases she says all the time is some little boy. The theater group was working with children, and this little boy kept saying, "It can happen. It can happen." And I have another poem which I wanted to read, but it's not in this book, in which I was riding a bicycle. Friend and I were riding our bicycles in the Midwest, in the middle of nowhere, on a bicycle tour, and we came. I'm telling you, we're running out of time.
We never run out of time for Dr. Nelson.
Okay, we came to a 4-way stop in the middle of this nowhere town, and a pickup truck barreled through in front of us. And the guy, my friend said, that was a 4-way stop. And the truck driver leaned out and called us the N-word and drove off. And we looked at each other and rode on out of town into fields, nothing around us. And then suddenly this truck appeared behind us and honked his horn. And we got off our bicycles and stood shoulder to shoulder. We thought we were going to have to fight with this guy.
Yeah.
And he got out of the truck and stood next to it and said, "What happened back there?" And my friend said, "That was a 4-way stop. You went through it." And I said, "It's a 4-way stop." And he said, "And what did I say?" And my friend said, "You said the N-word." And the guy said, "Well, I just want to say I'm sorry."
Wow.
It can happen.
It can happen. It can happen. And
Yeah.
Dr. Nelson, it can happen that you relocate from Connecticut to Sacramento. It can happen.
It can happen.
It can happen. Dr. Nelson, thank you so very much for being Dr. Nelson. Thank you for being who you are and being open to being used in so many ways. And I invite you to come back anytime. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pastor Meeks.